I still remember the weight of that moment, not just the heaviness of my 9-month pregnant belly, but the crushing weight of public humiliation. The subway car rocked gently beneath my swollen feet as I clutched the metal pole, my knuckles white with effort. Every pair of eyes in that crowded car witnessed what happened next, a scene that would ultimately change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Olivia Carter. I was once the woman who smiled and nodded, who swallowed her words to keep the peace, who believed that loving someone meant accepting whatever scraps of dignity they left for you. This is the story of how I found my voice in the most unexpected place, a crowded New York City subway car, and how 3 words from a stranger gave me permission to finally speak my truth. Before I met Eric, I was someone else entirely, a bright-eyed journalism graduate from the University of Michigan with big dreams of writing stories that mattered. I'd moved to New York with nothing but 2 suitcases and a notebook full of ideas, renting a tiny apartment in Brooklyn that leaked when it rained but had a window that framed the Manhattan skyline like a postcard. "You're going to conquer this city," my father told me the day I left home. Dad had raised me alone after my mother died when I was 12, and he'd spent years teaching me to stand tall in a world that often tried to make women small. "Remember who you are, Liv," he'd say. "A Carter never bends." For 3 years, I didn't bend. I worked my way up from coffee runner to junior reporter at a respected online publication. I made friends who became family, exploring the city's hidden corners on weekends. I dated casually but remained focused on building my career. I was confident, independent, the kind of woman who spoke up in meetings and didn't apologize for taking up space. Then Eric Sullivan walked into the press conference I was covering. He stood tall in his Navy uniform, metal Z, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. A decorated Navy officer speaking about a rescue mission his team had completed. While other reporters asked about tactics and political implications, I asked about the families they'd saved, the human element that others overlooked. After the conference, he approached me. "Your question was different," he said with a smile that softened his military bearing. "Most people don't think to ask about the civilians. The numbers matter less than the names," I replied. "At least, that's what I believe." He asked me to coffee, which turned into dinner, which turned into the most intoxicating 3 months of my life. Eric was everything I thought I wanted. Strong, principled, passionate about serving others. When he spoke about his military career, I saw a man dedicated to protecting the vulnerable. When he listened to my stories, I felt truly seen. "You're unlike anyone I've ever met, Olivia," he told me on the night he proposed, just 4 months after we'd met. We stood on the Brooklyn Bridge, the city lights sparkling around us like fallen stars. "You make me want to be better." I said yes without hesitation. My father raised an eyebrow at the speed of it all when I called to tell him, but he heard the happiness in my voice and gave his blessing. "Just remember who you are," he said, his usual refrain. "Marriage is a partnership, not a surrender." I laughed at his concern. "Dad, Eric respects my independence. That's what I love about him." The wedding was small but perfect, a ceremony in Central Park where my father walked me down a petal-strewn path. Eric's mother, Evelyn, was the only one from his side who attended. His father had passed years ago, and he had no siblings. Evelyn stood rigid in her tailored gray suit, a tight smile that never reached her eyes as she watched us exchange vows. "She's just protective," Eric explained later. "It's been just the 2 of us for so long." I understood. After losing my own mother, I knew how close grief could bind people together. So when Evelyn hugged me stiffly at the reception and whispered, "I hope you know what you're getting into, dear," I chose to see concern rather than warning. Our first months of marriage were a delicate dance of adjustment. Eric had recently been assigned to a desk position at the naval base in Brooklyn, which meant regular hours but also a certain restlessness in him. I continued my reporting work, though Eric often commented that my late nights at the office were challenging for our marriage. "A military man needs structure at home," he would say, "especially when everything at work is strictly regulated." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began adjusting my schedule to accommodate his needs, leaving work earlier, making sure dinner was ready when he arrived home, taking on more of the household responsibilities because his work is so demanding. 6 months into our marriage, I discovered I was pregnant. Eric's face lit up with a joy I hadn't seen since our wedding day. "This changes everything," he said, his hand gentle on my still flat stomach. "You're carrying the next Sullivan. A boy, I bet." That night he called, and his mother. Within a week, Evelyn had arrived at our door with 3 suitcases and an air of authority that filled our small apartment. "You can't possibly continue working in your condition," she declared on her second day. eyeing my press credentials with disdain. Eric needs a proper home, especially now. Mom knows best, Eric said with a shrug when I questioned him later. She raised me, alone while my father was deployed. She knows what a military family needs. But I'm still in my first trimester, I argued, and my doctor says it's perfectly fine to continue working. Eric's face hardened slightly. Doctors don't understand the Sullivan family values, Olivia. We take care of our own. My mother's here to help you become a proper military wife. There it was. The first clear glimpse of what would become my new reality. Not a partnership, but a rank, and I was clearly the subordinate. Still, I tried to adjust. I told myself that marriage required compromise, that family meant adapting. When Evelyn rearranged our kitchen without asking, I stayed silent. When she criticized my cooking as not nutritious enough for my grandson, I took notes on her preferred methods. When she began answering questions directed at me during doctor appointments, I swallowed my frustration. And Eric, the man who had once looked at me with such admiration, began to look through me instead. His posture stiffened at home, as though our apartment had become another base where he and his mother were the commanding officers. His requests became orders, delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. By my 6th month of pregnancy, the woman I had been, the journalist, the independent spirit, my father's daughter, felt like someone I'd known in another life. I stopped writing altogether. I let my press contacts go cold. I spent my days preparing meals according to Evelyn's specifications and listening to stories about Eric's childhood, tales that always emphasized how he had been raised to command respect. Sullivan men lead, Evelyn would say, glancing meaningfully at my growing belly. And Sullivan women support. That's the natural order. When I called my father, I painted a picture brighter than reality. Everything's fine, I'd insist, just adjusting to pregnancy. But he knew me too well. You don't sound like yourself, Liv, he said during one call. Remember who you are. But by then, I wasn't sure I remembered anymore. The woman who had once asked fearless questions in press conferences now hesitated to ask if she could choose what to wear. The woman who had navigated New York's chaos with confidence now needed permission to visit a friend. I was 7 months pregnant when Eric started calling me soldier, not as an endearment, but as a designation. Attention, soldier, he would say when entering a room, expecting me to straighten despite my swollen body. Status report on dinner. Evelyn would watch these interactions with satisfaction, occasionally offering commentary. She's learning, son. Slowly, but she's learning. I was disappearing, inch by inch, word by word. My silence grew heavier as my pregnancy advanced, until it felt like I was carrying 2 unbearable weights, my child and my unspoken truth. Until that day on the subway, when everything changed. It was mid-July, and New York was suffering through a heat wave that turned the city into a concrete oven. At 8.5 months pregnant, my body had become a furnace of its own, my ankles swollen to the point where most of my shoes no longer fit. But Evelyn had insisted we needed to visit a specific baby store in Manhattan that sold the only acceptable crib for a Sullivan. The one you registered for is flimsy, she declared over breakfast, while Eric nodded in agreement. A Sullivan baby needs quality. I had researched that crib for weeks. It had the highest safety ratings and fit perfectly in the nursery I'd painstakingly prepared. But arguing had become pointless. We'll take the subway, Eric announced. Parking in that area is impossible. I glanced out the window at the heat rippling off the pavement. Maybe we could order online? The temperature's supposed to hit 95 degrees today. Eric's jaw tightened, a warning sign I'd learned to recognize. Olivia's need to be tougher than the weather, soldier. My mother managed much worse, while carrying me. And so we went, the 3 of us stepping into the suffocating heat. By the time we reached the subway station, my sundress was clinging to my skin, and each breath felt like drawing in steam. The platform was crowded with tourists and commuters, everyone slightly irritable in the oppressive heat. When the train arrived, it was packed. Eric moved ahead, creating space for his mother while I followed behind, one hand on my lower back to counter the ache that had been my constant companion for weeks. Evelyn immediately claimed one of the poles, her hand wrapped around it possessively as we swayed with the train's movement. I stood beside them, trying to maintain my balance as the train lurched forward. My center of gravity had shifted so dramatically with pregnancy that each turn of the subway sent me tilting dangerously. I gripped the overhead bar, but my arms ached with the strain of holding myself steady. 3 stops in, an elderly gentleman rose from his seat. "Ma'am," he said, gesturing to me, "please sit down. You look like you're due any day now." The relief that washed over me was immediate. I smiled gratefully and had just lowered myself into the seat when I felt Eric's grip on my arm, sudden and tight. Before I could process what was happening, he yanked me back to my feet with such force that I stumbled. "Don't you dare sit while my mother is standing," he barked, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the subway car. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. Every passenger within earshot turned to stare. My face burned with humiliation as I struggled to regain my balance, one hand instinctively moving to protect my belly. Evelyn slid into the seat I'd been pulled from, adjusting her purse on her lap with a satisfied expression. "Thank you, son," she said primly. "These young women today don't understand proper respect." I stood trembling beside them, gripping the pole with white knuckles as the train swayed. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back furiously. I would not cry. Not here. Not now. The other passengers stared openly now, their expressions ranging from shock to discomfort to outright disapproval. The elderly man who had offered me his seat looked stricken, as though he'd inadvertently caused a disaster. A teenager with purple hair and multiple piercings glared daggers at Eric. A woman in a business suit shook her head slightly, but no one said anything. No one intervened. The collective silence seemed to validate what had just happened, as if this public humiliation was somehow acceptable, somehow normal, until she spoke. She sat 3 seats away from Evelyn, a small woman with a crown of silver hair, impeccably dressed in a light blue linen suit despite the heat. She must have been in her 70s, but she rose to her feet with the fluid grace of someone half her age. Her back was straight, her chin lifted, her eyes sharp with an authority that seemed to command the entire subway car. Mrs. Mildred Turner, though I wouldn't learn her name until later. She looked directly at Eric, then at Evelyn, then back to Eric. Her gaze was unwavering, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute moral certainty. "Shame on you," she said, each word distinct and cutting. Just 3 words, but they landed like physical blows. Eric's posture stiffened as though he'd been struck. Evelyn's smug expression faltered. "Young man," Mrs. Turner continued, stepping closer, "in all my 76 years, I have never seen such disgraceful behavior toward an expectant mother, especially from her own husband." The subway car, which moments before had been wrapped in uncomfortable silence, now hummed with tension. I could hear whispers starting, see heads nodding in agreement with the elderly woman's assessment. "This is a family matter," Eric replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "With all due respect, ma'am, this doesn't concern you. When you make it public, you make it everyone's concern," Mrs. Turner countered. She turned to Evelyn. "And you, madam, what kind of mother allows her son to treat his pregnant wife this way? What kind of grandmother risks her unborn grandchild's health for a seat?" Evelyn's face flushed an angry red. "How dare you? You know nothing about our family." "I know what I see," Mrs. Turner replied calmly. She turned to me then, her expression softening. "Dear, would you like my seat?" Before I could answer, another woman stood. "Take mine instead. It's closer." Then a young man in headphones. "No, mine. It has more room." Suddenly, there were 4 empty seats being offered to me from all corners of the subway car. Eric's hand tightened on my arm. "We're fine," he said through gritted teeth. Mrs. Turner's eyebrow arched. "Are you speaking for your wife now? Because she doesn't look fine. She looks like a woman who needs to sit down." Something broke inside me then, not in a shattering way, but in the way ice breaks on a river in spring, releasing what had been frozen beneath. I gently but firmly removed Eric's hand from my arm. "Thank you," I said to Mrs. Turner, my, voice steadier than I expected. "I would appreciate a seat." I moved toward her offered place, ignoring Eric's hissed warning. As I sat down, the relief was immediate and overwhelming. My body, which had been tensed against both pain and humiliation, seemed to sigh with gratitude. Mrs. Turner remained standing beside me, a silent guardian. Eric and Evelyn stood rigid by the doors, their faces twin, masks of fury and embarrassment. The rest of the ride passed in strained silence, but I felt something shifting within me. A quiet awakening, a remembering. "Remember who you are." My father's words echoed in my mind. When we reached our stop, Eric gripped my elbow to usher me out. As we stepped onto the platform, Mrs. Turner followed. "Young woman," she said, pressing something into my hand. "My card. Should you ever need assistance." Eric started to protest, but she cut him off with a look so fierce it stopped him mid-word. "Young man," she said quietly, I was a family court judge for 40 years. I recognize a situation when I see one. Take better care with your family, or someone else will. With that, she turned and reboarded the train, leaving us standing on the platform. Eric, seething, Evelyn muttering about interfering old women, and me clutching a small business card that felt in that moment like a lifeline. We never made it to the baby store. Instead, Eric marched us back to the apartment in glacial silence. Once inside, the storm broke. His voice rattled the windows as he paced our living room. "You humiliated me," he shouted. "Undermined my authority in public." "Eric," I said quietly, "you pulled a pregnant woman, your wife, out of a seat on a moving subway." "You defied me," he countered. "In front of my mother." Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed. "I raised my son to be respected," she added. "A Sullivan man must maintain order in his household." I looked between them, suddenly seeing with painful clarity what I had become in their eyes. Not a partner, not even a person, just a subordinate rank in their rigid family hierarchy. "I need to lie down," I said, exhaustion washing over me. "We're not finished discussing this," Eric snapped. But I was already walking away, one hand on my belly, feeling my child kick as if in solidarity. In our bedroom, I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small, cream-colored card in my hand. Mildred Turner, Escuner, retired, family court judge, New York County. Justice begins with dignity, along with a phone number. I slipped the card into my bedside drawer and lay back against the pillows, my hand protectively cradling my belly. "I remember who I am," I whispered to my unborn child, "and I promise you'll never forget who you are either." Outside the door, I could hear Eric and Evelyn still discussing the incident in heated tones. But inside, in the quiet space between my heart and my child's, something had fundamentally changed. The woman who had boarded that subway was not the same one who had stepped off. The week following the subway incident unfolded in a strange detente. Eric maintained a cold military precision in his interactions with me. Formal, distant, as though I'd been demoted rather than wronged. Evelyn doubled down on her supervision, rarely leaving me alone, her commentary on my insubordination a constant background noise to my days. "In my day," she would say while watching me fold laundry, "a wife understood her place in the home's chain of command." I said little in response, but inside, something had awakened. Judge Turner's words echoed in my mind. Justice begins with dignity. I began to observe my situation with the detached clarity of the reporter I once was, mentally documenting the patterns I'd been too deep inside to recognize. I noticed how Eric's expressions mirrored his mother's, his disapproval activating the moment her face showed the slightest displeasure. I saw the careful way Evelyn orchestrated situations to assert her dominance, scheduling appointments during times I'd planned to rest, rearranging the nursery I'd organized, commenting on my excessive food portions. Most importantly, I recognized the woman I had become. Silent, acquiescent, a shadow moving through my own life. This realization didn't come as a sudden epiphany, but as a slow dawning horror, like waking, gradually to find yourself buried alive. On the surface, I maintained the peace. I prepared their meals, listened to their critiques, nodded at appropriate intervals. But beneath this compliant exterior, I was making plans. First, I called my father. "Dad," I said when he answered, my voice low as I stood in the bathroom with the shower running to mask the conversation. "I need to tell you something." I told him everything. The control that had crept in so gradually I hardly noticed. Evelyn's arrival and takeover, Eric's transformation from partner to commander, and finally, the subway incident. "I'll be on the next plane," he said immediately, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "No," I replied. "Not yet. I need to figure some things out first. But I might need a place to stay soon." "Your home is always waiting for you, Liv," he said. "Both of you," he added, meaning the baby. That night, I lay awake beside Eric, studying the rigid line of his back turned away from me. How had I not seen that his love came with conditions? That his affection depended on my obedience? Perhaps because he'd never had to enforce those conditions until Evelyn arrived to show him how. The next day, while Eric was at work and Evelyn was napping, I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened my laptop and began to write. Not an article, but a detailed account of everything that had happened since our marriage. Times, dates, incidents, patterns. The journalist in me knew that documentation would be crucial if things deteriorated further. I also made 3 important calls. The first was to my obstetrician, requesting a private appointment without Evelyn or Eric present. I need to discuss some concerns, I told the receptionist, and I need the conversation to remain confidential. The second was to my old editor, Rachel. Olivia Carter, she exclaimed when she realized who was calling. The prodigal reporter returns. Please tell me you're bored with domestic bliss and want your job back. Not exactly, I said, feeling a lump form in my throat at her friendly voice. But I could use some advice from someone who's always seen clearly. Rachel had been divorced twice and approached relationships with the same sharp analysis she applied to breaking news. We arranged to meet for coffee the following day during Evelyn's standing hair appointment. The one predictable hour I could count on being alone. The third call was the hardest to make. I stared at Judge Turner's card for a long time before punching in the numbers. Mildred Turner, answered a crisp voice. Judge Turner, I began. This is Olivia Sullivan, from the subway last week. I'm not sure if you remember. I remember exactly who you are, Mrs. Sullivan, she interrupted. I've been wondering if you would call. We spoke for 30 minutes. She didn't offer empty reassurances or push me toward decisions I wasn't ready to make. Instead, she listened, occasionally asking clarifying questions that cut to the heart of the matter. What do you want, Olivia? She finally asked. Not what you think you should want or what's expected of you, but what do you truly want for yourself and your child? No one had asked me that in so long that I found myself speechless. You don't need to answer right now, she said gently, but start asking yourself that question every day. And when you know the answer, we can discuss what comes next. That evening, as I prepared dinner under Evelyn's critical supervision, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't free yet, but I had created a small pocket of resistance, connections outside the careful isolation that had been constructed around me. You're quieter than usual, Evelyn observed suspiciously. Planning another public embarrassment for my son? I met her eyes steadily. I'm just focused on cooking, Evelyn. She blinked, surprised by the direct eye contact, a small deviation from my usual deference. When Eric came home, I noticed something new in his demeanor: uncertainty. The subway confrontation had disrupted his sense of absolute authority. He watched me carefully during dinner, as though trying to detect signs of further rebellion. How was your day, soldier? He asked, using the designation that had once made me wince but now only confirmed what I already knew. I was not his partner, but his subordinate. Productive, I replied simply. Later that night, as we prepared for bed, Eric attempted a reconciliation of sorts, not with words of apology, but with a possessive hand on my belly. The Sullivan heir is getting bigger, he said, his voice softening slightly. My son will be strong like his father. We don't know it's a boy, I reminded him. His face hardened immediately. Sullivan, firstborns are always sons. I didn't argue. There was no point. Instead, I turned away and pretended to fall asleep, while inside my mind continued to work, mapping possible futures, calculating risks, weighing options. The next day, my meeting with Rachel confirmed what I already suspected. This isn't normal, Liv, she said bluntly after I described my daily life. We sat in a back corner of a Yari coffee shop 10 blocks from my apartment, far enough that I wouldn't run into anyone who might report back to Evelyn. What you're describing is controlling behavior that's escalating. The subway wasn't a one-off incident. It was just the most public example. I know, I said quietly. Do you? She pressed. Because the Olivia I knew would never have tolerated this for a day, let alone months. Her words stung, but I knew she was right. It happened so gradually. I tried to explain. Each compromise seemed small at the time. And then I was pregnant, and it felt like I should try harder for the baby's sake. Rachel reached across the table and gripped my hand. Listen to me. The best thing you can do for your baby is to be the strong, independent woman you actually are. Not this submissive version they're trying to create. I nodded, tears threatening to spill over. I still have connections at the Women's Shelter Board, Rachel continued. If you need somewhere safe, I'm not there yet, I interrupted. I have my dad's place as a backup, but first I need to try something. What? A conversation, I said. One honest attempt to make Eric see what's happening. Rachel looked skeptical but didn't argue. Just promise me you won't wait until it's too late to leave if that conversation doesn't go well. I promised. My appointment with my obstetrician the following day was illuminating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Dr. Chen had always been warm and thorough, but without Evelyn's interruptions and Eric's hovering, she was also remarkably candid. Your blood pressure is higher than I'd like, Olivia, she said, studying my chart with a frown. And you've actually lost weight since your last visit, which isn't ideal in the third trimester. I've had some stress at home, I admitted. She looked up, her expression softening. You mentioned wanting to speak privately. Is everything all right? The simple question, asked with genuine concern rather than judgment, broke something open in me. I found myself telling her about the increasing control, the isolation, the subway incident. Dr. Chen listened attentively, then said something that would stay with me in the difficult days ahead. Pregnancy makes women physically vulnerable, Olivia, but it should never make you emotionally vulnerable. What you're describing is not just unhealthy for you, it's creating stress hormones that affect your baby. She wrote something in my chart, then looked at me directly. As your doctor, I'm concerned about the environment you're returning to. Stress and emotional distress can trigger early labor, and in some cases can affect the baby's development. What should I do? I asked, feeling suddenly overwhelmed. Medically speaking, you need calm, support, and rest. For these final weeks, she said firmly. And from what you've described, that may mean making some difficult decisions about your living situation. She handed me several pamphlets about pregnancy stress and domestic support services, which I tucked quickly into my purse. Your next appointment is in 1 week, she said. I want to see you then, alone, to check your blood pressure again. I left the clinic with a strange mixture of validation and terror. The professional confirmation that my situation was genuinely harmful, not just uncomfortable or challenging, made it impossible to continue the self-deception that had allowed me to endure for so long. That night, after dinner, I asked Eric to speak with me privately. Evelyn immediately objected. Whatever you need to discuss can be said in front of me, she insisted. There are no secrets in this family. But Eric, perhaps sensing my unusual determination, nodded. 10 minutes in the study. Once alone with the door closed, I took a deep breath and looked directly into the eyes of the man I had once believed would be my partner for life. Eric, things can't continue this way, I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. What happened on the subway was humiliating and dangerous. Dr. Chen says my blood pressure is too high, and the stress is affecting the baby. Eric's face remained impassive. Your doctor is overreacting. My mother raised me under much more stressful circumstances, and I turned out fine. This isn't about your mother, I said, fighting to keep my voice level. This is about us. Our marriage, our baby, our future. You promised to be my partner, but you've become my commanding officer instead. Something flickered in his eyes. A brief moment of recognition, quickly replaced by defensiveness. A family needs leadership, Olivia. Structure. Clear lines of authority. A family needs love, I countered. Respect. Equality. He scoffed. That's naive women's magazine nonsense. The real world requires order. Our home isn't a military base, Eric, and I'm not one of your subordinates. I'm your wife. His posture stiffened further. Then start acting like one. A proper wife supports her husband's decisions, respects his mother, and doesn't create public scenes. I could feel the conversation slipping away, any hope of genuine understanding fading with each exchange. Still, I had to try once more. I love you, Eric, I said quietly, but I don't recognize the man you've become, and I can't raise our child in an environment where their mother is treated as less than human. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw a crack in his armor, a flicker of the man I had fallen in love with. But then the study door opened, and Evelyn stood there, her timing too perfect to be coincidental. She had been listening the entire time. Your 10 minutes are up, she announced, and dinner dishes are still waiting, Olivia. Eric's momentary vulnerability vanished, his expression hardening as he looked to his mother, then back to me. We're done here, he said, standing abruptly. I expect things to improve, soldier. Consider this a final warning. As he walked past me, following his mother out of the study, I realized with absolute clarity that the conversation I had hoped would save my marriage had instead confirmed that it was already over. Whatever connection had once existed between us had been severed, not by my resistance, but by his choice to prioritize authority over love. That night, I quietly packed a small bag and hid it in the back of my closet. Not yet ready to leave, but prepared for when that moment came. It arrived sooner than I expected. My water broke at 3:17 a.m., 2 weeks before my due date. I woke to the sensation of warmth spreading across the sheets, followed immediately by a cramping pain that took my breath away. Eric, I gasped, reaching for his shoulder in the darkness. The baby's coming. He grunted and rolled over, not fully awake. Probably just those fake contractions. Go back to sleep. No, I insisted, gripping his arm harder as another contraction seized me. My water broke. We need to go to the hospital now. This got his attention. He sat up abruptly, fumbling for the bedside lamp. In the sudden harsh light, his expression shifted from annoyance to alarm as he saw the wet sheets. I'll get Mother, he said, already reaching for his robe. Call the hospital first, I urged, but he was already out the door, calling for Evelyn. I forced myself to breathe through the next contraction while reaching for my phone to call Dr. Chen's emergency line. The contractions were coming quickly. Too quickly for a first labor, I thought with rising anxiety. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her hair in curlers, her expression oscillating between excitement and displeasure at being woken. So it's time, she announced, surveying the scene with clinical detachment. Eric is calling the hospital. I'll prepare your bag. It's already packed, I managed between breaths. Under the bed. She looked surprised, then suspicious. Planning something, were you? Before I could respond, another contraction gripped me, stronger than the last. I gasped, doubling over. Evelyn, please, I pleaded. This is happening fast. We need to go now. She frowned. First, babies take hours. Don't be dramatic. Eric reappeared, now fully dressed. Hospital says to come in. I'll bring the car around. As he left, Evelyn began methodically collecting items from around the room, ignoring my increasingly distressed breathing. We need to go, I insisted, struggling to stand. The contractions are only a few minutes apart. I've been through labor, dear, she replied dismissively. You have hours yet. A Sullivan takes their time being born. But my body disagreed with her assessment. The pain was intensifying, the contractions coming in relentless waves. I managed to pull on a dress over my nightgown and slip my feet into sandals while leaning heavily against the wall. Where's Eric? I gasped, looking toward the hallway. Bringing the car around, Evelyn repeated, still calmly folding baby clothes that we wouldn't need at the hospital. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The contractions were now less than 2 minutes apart, each one leaving me trembling and breathless. Something wasn't right. This was happening too. Fast. Call Eric, I demanded through gritted teeth. Find out what's taking so long. Evelyn sighed but picked up her phone. After a brief conversation, her expression changed. The car won't start, she reported. He's trying to get it going. Another contraction seized me, so powerful I couldn't remain standing. I sank to the floor, a primal sound escaping from deep within me. I need to push, I realized with sudden clarity and terror. Evelyn, call 911. The baby is coming now. Instead of reaching for her phone, Evelyn knelt beside me and gripped my hand with surprising strength. Listen to me, Olivia. Sullivan women are strong. You can wait. Control yourself until Eric fixes the car. I stared at her in disbelief. This isn't about control. This is biology. Call an ambulance. Something shifted in her eyes. Not compassion, but determination. She stood and walked to the door. I'll check on Eric, she said. Try to hold on. And then she was gone, leaving me alone on the bedroom floor as my body prepared to deliver a child. In that moment of abandoned vulnerability, a strange calm washed over me. I reached for my phone, which had fallen nearby, and with shaking fingers, I dialed 911. Emergency services, came the dispatcher's steady voice. What's your emergency? I'm in active labor, I managed. Contractions less than 2 minutes apart. I'm alone and need help immediately. The dispatcher's professional tone was instantly reassuring. I'm sending an ambulance now. Stay on the line with me. What's your name? Olivia Sullivan. Okay, Olivia. Is this your first baby? Yes. Is there anyone there with you? I hesitated, then answered honestly. No. My husband and mother-in-law are unavailable. If the dispatcher found this strange, she didn't show it. The ambulance is 4 minutes out. I need you to lie on your left side if possible. Are you having the urge to push? Yes, I admitted, another contraction building. It's getting harder not to. If you need to push, Olivia, your body knows what it's doing. I'm going to stay with you until help arrives. Those simple words, I'm going to stay with you, broke something open inside me. Tears streamed down my face as I positioned myself as instructed, phone clutched to my ear like a lifeline. The next few minutes blurred into a haze of pain and focus. I was vaguely aware of sirens approaching, then voices in the apartment, footsteps rushing toward the bedroom. 2 paramedics appeared, a woman with cropped dark hair and a tall man with kind eyes. Olivia? the woman said, kneeling beside me. I'm Sarah. This is Jack. We're going to help you, okay? They worked with swift efficiency, checking my vitals, assessing the situation, preparing for the possibility of delivering. Right there on the bedroom floor. Where's your husband? Jack asked as he set up equipment. I don't know, I admitted, and was surprised to find I didn't care. The only thing that mattered now was bringing my child safely into the world. Just as they were preparing to move me to a stretcher, Eric burst into the room, followed by Evelyn. What's happening? He demanded, looking at the paramedics with suspicion. Who called you? I did, I said between controlled breaths. The baby's almost here. Eric's face flushed with anger. You should have waited. I was handling the situation. Sarah, the paramedic, gave him a sharp look. Sir, your wife is in advanced labor. There's no waiting in this situation. We need to move her now, Jack added, his tone brooking no argument. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, another powerful contraction gripped me. I cried out, clutching Sarah's hand. I can see the head, she announced after a quick check. This baby's coming right now. We don't have time to get to the ambulance. What followed was a blur of urgent instructions, controlled chaos, and the most intense physical experience of my life. Eric stood frozen in the doorway, Evelyn behind. Him, both looking stunned as the paramedics transformed our bedroom into an emergency delivery room. Push when you're ready, Olivia, Sarah encouraged. You're doing great. With the next contraction, I gathered all my strength and pushed, a primal scream tearing from my throat. I was dimly aware of Eric wincing at the sound, of Evelyn's disapproving murmur about maintaining composure, but they seemed miles away, irrelevant to the work my body was doing. One more big push, Jack instructed. I bore down with everything I had, feeling an impossible stretching, burning sensation, followed by a sudden release and a tiny, indignant cry. It's a girl, Sarah announced, placing a squirming, pink little body on my chest. A beautiful baby girl. A daughter. My daughter. I gazed down at her. Perfect, angry little face, her fingers curled into tiny fists, and felt a love so overwhelming it eclipsed everything else. The pain, the fear, the months of diminishment. In that moment, I was remade, stronger, and more certain than I had ever been. That can't be right, Evelyn said from the doorway. Sullivan firstborns are always boys. I didn't look up from my daughter's face. Well, she didn't get the memo. The paramedics laughed, but Eric remained silent, his expression unreadable as he watched us from a distance. What's her name? Sarah asked as she efficiently clamped and cut the umbilical cord. I hadn't discussed names with Eric. He had been so certain we were having a boy that he refused to consider alternatives. But in that moment, looking into my daughter's eyes, I knew exactly what to call her. Mildred, I said firmly. Mildred Carter Sullivan. I heard Evelyn's sharp intake of breath. Carter? That's not a Sullivan family name. It's my family name, I replied, not taking my eyes off my daughter. And she is half Carter. And Mildred? Eric finally spoke, his voice strained. After who? I looked up then, meeting his gaze steadily. After someone who taught me about dignity. The paramedics continued their work, checking my vitals, preparing us for transport to the hospital. As they wheeled us toward the door, Eric finally approached, reaching tentatively toward the baby. My daughter, he said, his voice a strange mixture of awe and disappointment. Our daughter, I corrected gently. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a softening in his eyes, a glimpse of the man I had once loved. But then Evelyn stepped forward. Eric, get your car started, she instructed. We'll follow the ambulance. I'll ride with Olivia. The paramedics exchanged glances. We typically only allow one family member in the ambulance, Jack said carefully. I want my father, I said suddenly. Can someone call my father? The clarity of my request seemed to surprise everyone, including me. Eric's face hardened again. Your father? He's not even in the state. Actually, he is, I replied. He's been staying at a hotel nearby for the past week. I asked him to come when I suspected the baby might arrive early. This was a lie. My father was still in Michigan. But the shock on Eric and Evelyn's faces gave me a moment of satisfaction. More importantly, it created enough confusion that the paramedics were able to whisk me into the ambulance without either of them accompanying us. As the doors closed, I caught a final glimpse of Eric and Evelyn standing in the building entrance, looking strangely diminished, no longer the commanding presences that had dominated my life, but simply a man and woman watching as something precious slipped from their grasp. In the ambulance, cradling my newborn daughter against my chest, I used the paramedic's phone to make 2 calls, one to my father, telling him to come immediately, and one to Judge Turner. "It's Olivia Sullivan," I said when she answered, her voice alert despite the early hour. "I've had my baby, and I need your help." "Congratulations," she replied warmly. "And of course, tell me what you need." "I need to start over," I said, looking down at my daughter's perfect face. "For both of us." "Then that's exactly what you'll do," Judge Turner said, with the simple confidence of someone who had seen countless women find their strength in moments of crisis. "And you won't do it alone." As the ambulance sped through the pre-dawn streets, I felt something unfamiliar but unmistakable settling into my bones. Not just exhaustion or the aftershocks of birth, but a certainty that had been missing for too long. I remembered who I was. The hospital was mercifully quiet at that early hour. The labor and delivery nurses moved with practiced efficiency, settling me and Mildred into a private room while the on-call obstetrician examined us both. "You're lucky," Dr. Ramirez said as she checked Mildred's vital signs. "Despite the precipitous labor, you're both doing remarkably well. But we'll want to keep you for at least 48 hours to monitor you both." I nodded, relief washing over me. 48 hours. 2 days of safety within these walls. 2 days to plan our next steps. My father arrived just after dawn, his face drawn with worry that transformed into joy when he saw Mildred in my arms. "She's perfect, Liv," he whispered, gently touching her tiny hand. "Just like you were." I didn't realize I was crying until he handed me a tissue. "Dad, I've made such a mess of everything." "No," he said firmly. "You've brought this beautiful child into the world under difficult circumstances. That's not a mess. That's courage." Before I could respond, the door opened and, Eric walked in. He'd changed his clothes and carried a bouquet of flowers that looked hastily purchased from the hospital gift shop. My father straightened, placing himself slightly between me and the door. "Henry," Eric said stiffly, acknowledging my father with a nod. "I didn't realize you were here. Where else would I be when my granddaughter is born?" My father replied, his tone pleasant, but his eyes sharp with assessment. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them until Eric stepped forward, placing the flowers on the bedside table. "How are you feeling?" he asked me, his voice formal. "Tired," I answered honestly, "but happy to have her here safely." Eric's gaze moved to Mildred, sleeping peacefully in my arms. Something flickered across his face. Pride, confusion, or perhaps disappointment that the son he'd been promised hadn't materialized. He began, then paused, seeming to search for the appropriate word. "She's small." My father made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "All babies are small, Eric. That's rather the point of them." Eric's posture stiffened at the gentle mockery. "Where's Mother? They wouldn't let her up without your permission." This last part was directed at me with a hint of accusation. "I need some time," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "Just us and my dad for now." "She's a Sullivan," Eric replied immediately. "Mother has every right to see her grandchild." "She has a name, Eric," I reminded him quietly. "Mildred. And she'll meet her grandmother soon enough." Eric's jaw tightened. He glanced at my father, then back to me. "I need to speak with my wife alone." "Not happening," my father said simply. "With all due respect, sir, this is between me and Olivia." "With all due respect back," my father replied, his voice remaining calm, but taking on the steel I remembered from my childhood when he encountered injustice. "My daughter just gave birth under extraordinary stress. Nothing is more important than her recovery and the baby's well-being right now. Whatever you need to say can wait, or it can be said with me present." Eric looked to me, expecting me to overrule my father, to fall back into the pattern of acquiescence we'd established. Instead, I shifted Mildred slightly in my arms and said, "Dad's right. I'm too tired for a private conversation right now, Eric." Something changed in his expression then, a realization, perhaps, that the dynamics had shifted irrevocably. Without another word, he turned and left the room. "He'll be back," my father said, once the door closed, and with reinforcements, I'd wager. He was right. Less than an hour later, Eric returned with Evelyn and a hospital administrator in tow. The administrator, a harried-looking man with a clipboard, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Sullivan," he began, "we have a situation regarding your visitor policy. Your husband has requested that his mother be permitted to visit, which is standard hospital procedure for immediate family. And I've requested a bit of time to recover first," I replied calmly. Which we completely understand, the administrator continued, glancing nervously at Evelyn's stormy expression. However, Mr. Sullivan has pointed out that as the father, he has equal say in visitation for the child. I see, I said, looking directly at Eric. And is that what this is about? Using hospital policy to force your way? Eric had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Mother simply wants to meet her granddaughter. I don't understand why you're being difficult about this. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door, and Judge Turner walked in, followed by a woman I didn't recognize carrying a leather briefcase. Perfect timing, Judge Turner said, surveying the scene with a practiced eye. Olivia, I hope you don't mind that I brought my colleague Patricia Winters. She's an excellent family law attorney. The hospital administrator looked increasingly distressed. I'm sorry, but this room is getting quite crowded, and hospital policy is perfectly clear on the rights of new mothers, Patricia interrupted smoothly, including the right to limit visitation if she feels it would negatively impact her recovery. Evelyn stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. This is outrageous. I am that child's grandmother. And you'll have many opportunities to fulfill that role, Judge Turner replied evenly. But right now, Olivia has made her wishes clear. This is a family matter, Eric insisted. We don't need outsiders involved. Patricia smiled thinly. Actually, Mr. Sullivan, when you brought the hospital administration into what should have been a private discussion, you made it more than a family matter. The administrator, clearly wishing to be anywhere else, clutched his clipboard tighter. Perhaps we should give Mrs. Sullivan some time to rest and discuss this later. An excellent suggestion, my father agreed. Eric looked from Judge Turner to Patricia to me, a dawning realization in his eyes. You planned this, he said accusingly. You were already talking to lawyers before the baby was even born. Eric, I said quietly, this isn't the time or place. Please just give me today. We can talk tomorrow. For a moment, I thought he might refuse, might escalate the situation further. But something in my expression, or perhaps the united front of my supporters, made him reconsider. Fine, one day, he conceded, but we will discuss this tomorrow, Olivia. All of it. He looked pointedly at Judge Turner and Patricia before taking his mother's arm and leading her from the room. The administrator followed quickly, muttering apologies. Once they were gone, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Mildred stirred in my arms, her tiny face scrunching momentarily before relaxing back into sleep. That went about as expected, Judge Turner remarked, taking the seat my father offered her. Patricia opened her briefcase and withdrew a legal pad. Olivia, I know this is an overwhelming time, but we need to discuss your options and how you want to proceed. Proceed with what exactly? I asked, suddenly feeling the weight of everything crashing down on me. The exhaustion of childbirth, the emotional turmoil of the confrontation, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. With whatever you decide, Patricia said gently. Separation, divorce, custody arrangements, protective orders, or reconciliation, if that's what you ultimately want. But the important thing is that you understand your rights and the potential paths forward. I looked down at Mildred, so perfect and innocent, unaware of the storm surrounding her entrance into the world. I don't want to make any permanent decisions right now, I admitted. I'm too tired, too emotional. That's completely understandable, Judge Turner assured me. No one expects you to decide everything today, but there are some temporary measures we can put in place to give you space and time to think clearly. We spent the next hour discussing practical matters, a temporary restraining order that would limit when and how Eric and Evelyn could visit, the possibility of staying with my father when we were discharged, the documentation I would need to start gathering if I decided to pursue divorce. The most important thing right now is creating a peaceful environment for you and Mildred, Patricia emphasized. Everything else can be addressed when you're stronger. By the time they left, I had a clearer sense of the path ahead, not the entire journey, but at least the next few steps. My father stayed, settling into the recliner beside my bed with the comfortable determination of someone prepared for a long siege. Get some rest, Liv, he encouraged as my eyelids grew heavy. I'll be right here. As I drifted into sleep, Mildred secure in the hospital bassinet beside me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Safety. Not just physical safety, but the profound security of being surrounded by people who valued my autonomy, who saw me as a whole person rather than a subordinate to be commanded. When I woke several hours later, the room was dimmed for evening, and a nurse was quietly checking Mildred's vital signs. She's perfect, the nurse whispered with a smile. You did good. Mama. My father was still there, reading a book under the soft glow of the bedside lamp. He looked up when he noticed I was awake. How are you feeling? Better, I said, surprised to find it was true. Clearer. He nodded, understanding what I meant. Your phone's been buzzing. Eric's called several times. I didn't answer. Thank you. I hesitated, then added, Dad, I don't think I can go back. There. I never expected you would, he replied simply. Your room at home is ready whenever you are. For both of you. Tears welled in my eyes. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. About how things really were. You're telling me now, he said. That's what matters. The next day passed in a blur of nursing sessions, doctor checks, and visits from hospital staff. Eric called repeatedly, but respected the temporary boundaries we'd established, not appearing in person. Evelyn, however, made her displeasure known through a series of increasingly accusatory text messages that I eventually stopped reading. Judge Turner returned briefly, this time alone. Patricia has prepared the paperwork, she informed me. But nothing needs to be filed until you're ready. How are you feeling about everything today? Stronger, I admitted. More certain. She smiled. That's how it usually goes. Clarity comes with distance. By the evening of our second day in the hospital, Dr. Ramirez pronounced us both ready for discharge the following morning. You've recovered remarkably well, she observed, and little Mildred is thriving. I thanked her, then asked the question that had been weighing on me. Doctor, if I don't go back to my apartment, if I stay somewhere else for a while, will that be okay for the baby? Dr. Ramirez's expression softened with understanding. Medically speaking, what's best for your baby is what's best for you. A calm, supportive environment is far more important than any specific location. As she left, I turned to my father. Tomorrow morning, then, we'll go home with you. He squeezed my hand. I'll bring the car around at 9. That night, I wrote Eric a letter. Not an email or text that could be forwarded or shared, but an actual handwritten letter on hospital stationery. I explained that I would be staying with my father when discharged, that I needed time and space to consider our future, that I would ensure he had appropriate time with Mildred once we were settled. I sealed it in an envelope and asked the night nurse to give it to him if he came by in the morning. Then I settled in for my last night in the safety of the hospital, Mildred sleeping peacefully beside me, both of us poised on the edge of a new beginning. When morning came, I dressed carefully in the comfortable clothes my father had brought from home, then helped. The nurse swaddled Mildred in the soft yellow blanket I had packed in my hospital bag weeks ago, not the monogrammed Sullivan family blanket Evelyn had insisted we use. As I was signing the discharge papers, there was a commotion in the hallway. Raised voices, the sound of hurried footsteps. I knew before the door opened that it was Eric. He burst in, still in his military uniform, clearly having come straight from the base. His face was flushed, his letter clutched in his hand. What is this? He demanded, waving the paper. You're just leaving? Taking my daughter? My father moved to stand beside me, but I placed a gentle hand on his arm. It's okay, Dad, I said quietly. Then to Eric. Yes, I'm going to stay with my father for a while. I explained that in the letter. This isn't request that requires my permission, Olivia. This is an announcement of kidnapping. The nurse who had been helping with our discharge paperwork slipped quietly from the room, likely to summon security. It's not kidnapping for a mother to take her child to her father's house, I replied, keeping my voice calm despite my racing heart. And I've already spoken with a lawyer about ensuring you have, appropriate visitation. Eric's face darkened further. Visitation? Like some weekend father? I am a Sullivan. We do not visit with our children. They live under our roof, under our authority. And that right there, I said quietly, is why I can't come home with you. A child isn't a subordinate, Eric. Neither is a wife. This is Mother's fault, isn't it? He said suddenly. You've never given her a chance. You've fought her guidance from the beginning. The absurdity of this accusation might have made me laugh if the situation weren't so painful. This isn't about your mother, Eric. It's about what our marriage became, what you allowed it to become. A security guard appeared in the doorway, alerted by the nurse. Everything okay in here? Eric straightened immediately, his military training asserting itself in the presence of another authority figure. Fine, he said stiffly. I'm just discussing discharge plans with my wife. Mrs. Sullivan? The guard asked, looking to me. We're almost finished, I assured him. Thank you. The guard nodded but remained visible in the hallway, a silent reminder that this was still a protected space. Eric lowered his voice. Olivia, you're emotional right now? The hormones after childbirth? Don't, I interrupted. Don't dismiss my decisions as hormonal. I've never been clearer about anything. Then at least tell me what you want, he said, frustration evident in his voice. What will it take for you to come home? Mother can stay elsewhere for a while if that's the issue. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what I had been unable to see for months. A man genuinely baffled by my resistance, unable to comprehend that the problem wasn't just Evelyn's presence, but the fundamental way he viewed our relationship. It would take you seeing me as your equal, I said finally, not your subordinate, not a soldier to command, a partner with her own voice and dignity. Something flickered in his eyes. Confusion, perhaps, or the first glimmer of understanding. But it was quickly replaced by determination. I'll give you a week, he said. A week to come to your senses. Then we'll discuss this again like rational adults. With that, he turned and left, his posture military straight, giving the security guard a curt nod as he passed. My father let out a long breath. Well, that went about as well as could be expected. I nodded, gathering Mildred into my arms. She had slept through the entire confrontation, her face peaceful and untroubled. It's not over, I said, looking down at my daughter, but it's begun. As we walked out of the hospital into the bright morning sunshine, Mildred securely fastened in her car seat, I felt a strange mixture of grief and liberation. Something precious had been lost. The marriage I had believed in, the future I had imagined. But something equally precious had been found. My voice, my clarity, my uncompromising understanding of what my daughter and I deserved. Ready? My father asked as he opened the car door. I took one last look at the hospital behind us, then turned toward the road ahead. Ready? I confirmed. And I was. My father's house became our sanctuary. Located in a quiet suburb of Rochester, a 5-hour drive from New York City, it offered the distance and peace we needed. The home where I'd grown up remained largely unchanged. The same creaking porch swing, the same maple tree in the backyard, the same worn path in the carpet leading to the kitchen. My old bedroom had been maintained as a guest room, but Dad had already begun, transforming his office into a nursery, the walls freshly painted a soft green. I started when you called that day after the subway, he admitted, showing me the half-assembled crib. Just in case. The quiet suburban streets felt worlds away from the pressured environment I'd left behind. Here, no one monitored my meals or criticized my posture or timed my rest periods. I could nurse Mildred whenever she needed, sleep when she slept, exist in the gentle rhythm of new motherhood without judgment. For the first week, I focused solely on recovery and bonding with my daughter. I limited my phone usage, checking it only once a day to see if Eric had reached out in a way that suggested he might be reconsidering our dynamic. But his messages remained the same, demands thinly disguised as concerns, references to our family unit being restored, occasional mentions of Evelyn's distress at being separated from her granddaughter. He still doesn't understand, I told Patricia during a phone consultation at the end of that first week. He thinks this is a temporary rebellion that will resolve once I come to my senses. That's not unusual, she replied. In situations like yours, the controlling partner often struggles to recognize the fundamental issues. They see the symptoms. You're leaving, but not the disease itself. So what now? I asked, watching Mildred sleep in the portable bassinet beside me. Now we formalize the separation, she advised. Set clear boundaries and expectations while you decide if reconciliation is even possible. With Patricia's guidance, I drafted a formal separation agreement that outlined a visitation schedule for Eric, financial arrangements for Mildred's care, and the division of our personal belongings. I made it clear that any visits with Mildred would initially take place at my father's house, with my father present, and without Evelyn until Mildred was at least 2 months old. Eric's response came within hours of receiving the document, not a thoughtful consideration of the terms, but a terse message. Unacceptable. We'll discuss when I arrive this weekend. My father frowned when I showed him the text. He can't just show up here. Actually, he can, I sighed. I offered visitation, and this address is listed in the agreement. Then we'll be prepared, he said simply. Eric arrived that Saturday morning in a IC rental car, his posture military stiff as he walked up the driveway. My father opened the door before he could knock. Eric, he greeted him neutrally. Henry, Eric replied with a curt nod. I'm here to see my wife and daughter. Olivia's expecting you. my father said, stepping aside to allow him entry but not moving far from the door. I waited in the living room, Mildred asleep in my arms. When Eric entered, his eyes went immediately to the baby, his expression softening momentarily before hardening again as he looked at me. "You look well," he said stiffly. "Parenthood agrees with me," I replied. "Would you like to hold her?" He seemed surprised by the offer but nodded, carefully taking Mildred from me. His movements were awkward but gentle, and for a moment, watching him cradle. "Our daughter," I glimpsed the man I had fallen in love with. "She's grown already," he observed quietly. "Babies do that," I said with a small smile. "Especially when they're well-fed and loved." Eric glanced around the living room, taking in the baby items scattered about, the half-empty coffee cup on the side table, the general comfortable dishevelment of a house with a newborn. "This isn't a, proper environment for a Sullivan," he commented. And just like that, the glimpse of the old Eric vanished. "This is a home filled with love and acceptance," I corrected. "That's the most proper environment for any child." He frowned but didn't pursue the argument, instead returning to the real purpose of his visit. "I've reviewed your proposed agreement. It's unacceptable." "Which parts specifically?" "All of it. The visitation restrictions, the prohibition against mother seeing her granddaughter, the suggestion that you'll remain here indefinitely." I took a deep breath. "Those aren't punishments, Eric. They're boundaries to create a healthy environment for Mildred while we figure out our path forward." "Our path forward is clear," he stated firmly. "You'll return home with Mildred where you belong. Mother has agreed to give us more space as a new family. That should address your concerns." I studied his face, searching for any sign that he understood the deeper issues. There was none. "Eric," I said gently, "Evelyn's presence was a symptom, not the cause. The real problem is that you stopped seeing me as your equal partner. You began treating me as a subordinate to be commanded rather than a wife to be cherished." He shifted Mildred in his arms, clearly uncomfortable with this direction. "That's an exaggeration. I treated you with respect." "Respect isn't pulling your pregnant wife from a subway seat so your mother can sit instead," I countered quietly. "Respect isn't ignoring medical advice because it doesn't align with family traditions. Respect isn't calling your wife soldier and expecting her to report for duty." A flash of something crossed his face, perhaps the first glimmer of genuine reflection, but it was quickly replaced by defensiveness. "A family needs structure," he insisted. "Clear lines of authority." "A family needs love," I countered. "Mutual respect. Equality." Mildred began to stir in his arms, making the small mewing sounds that preceded hunger. I reached for her, and Eric reluctantly handed her back. "She needs to be fed," I explained, adjusting my shirt to nurse her. Eric looked away quickly, as though the act of breastfeeding was somehow improper. This, too, was revealing. How uncomfortable he was with the realities of parenthood that couldn't be contained within his rigid framework of order and control. "We can continue talking," I offered, but he stood abruptly. "I'll give you 2 weeks," he announced. 2 weeks to reconsider this separation nonsense. Then I'll expect you to return to New York with Mildred. And if I don't?" His expression hardened. "Then I'll pursue full custody. A Sullivan belongs with Sullivans." After he left, my father found me still sitting in the living room, Mildred nursing. Contentedly, tears streaming silently down my face. "I heard," he said simply, sitting beside me. "He doesn't get it at all, does he?" "No," I whispered. "And I'm not sure he ever will." Over the next 2 weeks, Eric called daily, each conversation following the same pattern. Formal inquiries about Mildred's development, terse updates about his work, and eventually reminders of his expectation that we would return to New York. Not once did he ask how I was feeling or acknowledge the issues I had raised. Meanwhile, I began rebuilding my life. I contacted my former editor, Rachel, explaining my situation and inquiring about freelance opportunities I could pursue remotely while caring for Mildred. She responded enthusiastically, offering me a weekly column about new motherhood that could be written from anywhere. "Your voice has been missed," she wrote, "and I suspect you have a lot to say now." I also connected with a local mothers group, finding solidarity and support among women who understood the challenges and joys of early parenthood. Some were married, some single, some happily partnered, others navigating complicated relationships, but all welcomed me without judgment. As Eric's 2-week deadline approached, I consulted again with Patricia. "He's threatened to pursue full custody," I told her. "Based on what grounds?" she asked. "You're the primary caretaker. You have a safe and stable living situation, and there's no evidence whatsoever of any parenting deficiencies on your part." He mentioned Sullivan family rights, as though the surname itself confers special privileges. Patricia's laugh was dry. That won't get far in family court. However, we should prepare for him to try. Military officers can sometimes present well to judges, and he may attempt to portray your leaving as abandonment or instability. What should I do? Document everything, she advised. Every visit, every call, every text. Keep a detailed journal of Mildred's care. Routine to demonstrate your capabilities as her mother. And most importantly, continue offering reasonable visitation while maintaining your boundaries. When the 2 weeks expired, Eric didn't arrive with moving vans or custody papers as threatened. Instead, he called. "I've been talking to some people," he said, his voice less certain than usual, "about our situation." "Oh?" I tried to keep the surprise from my voice. "My commanding officer suggested I speak with the base chaplain," he continued. "He had some perspectives I hadn't considered." This was unexpected. "What kind of perspectives?" Eric hesitated. "About partnership in marriage. About leadership versus control." Another pause. He asked me some uncomfortable questions about how I would want my daughter to be treated by her future husband. For the first time since the subway incident, I felt a flicker of hope. Not for reconciliation necessarily, but for Eric's growth, for the possibility that Mildred might have a father who could eventually model healthy relationships. "That sounds like a valuable conversation," I said carefully. "I'm not saying I agree with everything," he added quickly, "but I'm thinking about things, and I'm willing to respect your separation terms for now, while I do that thinking." It wasn't an apology or an acknowledgement of the harm done, but it was movement, a crack in the fortress of certainty he had built around himself. Over the following months, a careful routine developed. Eric visited every other weekend, gradually growing more comfortable with Mildred and occasionally showing glimpses of self-reflection. Evelyn remained in New York, sending formal cards and gifts, but respecting the boundaries I had established. I continued my freelance writing, finding my voice again through words shared with the world. Mildred thrived, growing from a tiny newborn into an alert, smiling infant who tracked movements with curious eyes and reached for the world with determined hands. My father delighted in his role as grandfather, singing old lullabies and telling stories that had once been part of my own childhood. The column about new motherhood expanded into a series about women reclaiming their power after relationships that diminished them. To my surprise, it resonated deeply with readers, generating a flood of emails from women with similar experiences. "You've tapped into something universal," Rachel observed during one of our check-ins. "The struggle to maintain identity within relationships that seek to reshape you." 6 months after Mildred's birth, I received an unexpected email from Eric. Not his usual brief update or visitation confirmation, but something longer, more thoughtful. He had been consistently working with the chaplain, he explained, and had come to recognize patterns in his behavior that stemmed from his own upbringing. "I'm not asking you to come back," he wrote. "I understand now why you left, even if I'm still learning to see all the ways I failed as a husband. But I am asking for a chance to be a better father to Mildred than I was a husband to you." It wasn't everything, but it was something. An acknowledgement of wrong without excuses, a step toward change without demands. I replied with cautious optimism, agreeing to discuss expanding his role in Mildred's life if he continued his personal growth work. When Judge Turner called to check on us, as she did periodically, I shared Eric's email with her. "Progress," she observed. "Not perfection, but progress." "Is it enough?" I asked, uncertain whether I should trust this evolution. "That depends on what you're measuring it against," she replied wisely. "It's certainly not enough to erase what happened or to justify reconciliation without profound change, but it might be enough to build a healthy co-parenting relationship, which is what Mildred needs most." And so we continued forward, one careful step at a time, me building a new life centered on my daughter and reclaimed independence, Eric gradually confronting the rigid worldview that had cost him his marriage, and Mildred growing into a joyful child surrounded by imperfect but loving adults. The fortress of control Eric had constructed was slowly being dismantled, not by force or siege, but by the quiet persistence of truth and the undeniable evidence of what love actually requires. 1 year after Mildred's birth, I stood in my father's backyard, watching her take uncertain steps across the grass, her tiny hands reaching toward me, her face alight with determination and joy. Each wobbling step forward represented not just her development, but my own. The journey from the woman who had once surrendered her voice to keep peace to the mother who now spoke her truth without apology. Look at you go, I encouraged as she managed 3 steps before tumbling gently onto the grass, her laughter bubbling up at what she clearly considered an adventure rather than a failure. From a nearby lawn chair, my father watched with undisguised pride. At 72, he had embraced his role as grandfather with a vigor that seemed to have shaved years off his appearance. His retirement now revolved around Millie time, as he called it, hours spent reading board books, building block towers, and teaching her the names of the birds that visited our feeders. She's got the Carter determination, he observed with a smile. Gets right back up and tries again. I nodded, watching as Mildred pulled herself up once more and prepared for another attempt, just like her mother finally learned to do. The past year had been one of profound transformation. My weekly column had expanded into a book deal, a memoir about reclaiming dignity after diminishment that resonated with readers far beyond what I'd anticipated. The advance had provided enough financial security that I'd been able to rent a small house just a few blocks from my father's, giving us both independence while maintaining our close support system. Eric and I had settled into a workable co-parenting arrangement. His visits were now consistent and, to my surprise, increasingly positive. The rigid commander who had once pulled me from a subway seat had gradually been replaced by a father who sat patiently on the floor building block towers, who had learned to change diapers. Without complaint, who asked questions about Mildred's development, rather than issuing declarations about how things should be done. It wasn't a perfect transformation. There were still moments when his military bearing reasserted itself, when he reflexively tried to impose structure where creativity was flourishing, when he spoke of proper behavior for a Sullivan. But these instances had become the exception rather than the rule, each one followed by a visible effort to catch himself, to reconsider, to choose a different way. The most significant change had come 6 months earlier, when Eric had arrived for his weekend visit alone, his expression somber. "I need to tell you something," he'd said after Mildred was down for her nap. "I've been transferred to California, San Diego Naval Base." My heart had sunk. Despite our separation, despite everything that had happened, Eric had been making genuine efforts to be present in Mildred's life. A cross-country move would change everything. "When do you leave?" I'd asked, already calculating the impact on Mildred, on our carefully constructed routine. 3 weeks. He'd hesitated, then added, "I've declined the transfer." "What?" "But your career is important," he'd finished, "but not more important than being Mildred's father." Another pause. "Not more important than continuing to work on being the man I should have been from the beginning." It had been the first time I truly believed he had changed, not just adapting his behavior to get what he wanted, but genuinely reordering his priorities based on a new understanding of what mattered. Now, as Mildred finally reached me after her determined journey across the grass, I scooped her up and spun her in a celebratory circle, her giggles filling the summer air. Over her shoulder, I noticed Eric's car pulling into the driveway. "Perfect timing," I told Mildred. "Daddy's here for your party." Eric approached with a wrapped gift, and something I'd rarely seen during our marriage, uncertainty. Despite our improved relationship, he still seemed to feel like a visitor in our lives rather than an integral part of them. It was a boundary he respected, never presuming intimacy or authority, always checking before making decisions involving Mildred. "Am I early?" he asked, glancing at his watch. "Right on time," my father assured him, rising to greet him with the cautious cordiality they had developed. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual respect built on their shared love for Mildred. "She's walking?" Eric asked, noticing Mildred's determined wriggling to be put down. "Just started this week," I confirmed, setting her on the grass. "Show Daddy what you can do, Millie." We watched together as she took 5 deliberate steps toward Eric before falling forward. He knelt to catch her, his face transformed by a smile of genuine wonder. "Look at you," he murmured, pride evident in his voice. "A Sullivan never quits, right? And a Carter never stops growing," my father added pointedly, his gentle correction a reminder that Mildred carried both legacies. To my surprise, Eric nodded. "You're absolutely right. She's the best of both." The small birthday gathering that followed was nothing like the formal affairs Evelyn would have insisted upon, with their rigid schedules and proper decorum. Instead, it was joyfully chaotic. Mildred smashing cake with enthusiastic hands, neighbors dropping by with small gifts, my writing group colleagues sharing stories and laughter. Through it all, I observed Eric, how he interacted with the guests, how he helped without being asked, how he carefully monitored his mother's brief video call to ensure it remained positive. Evelyn had remained in New York, sending elaborate gifts but maintaining a respectful distance that suggested she, too, had been forced to reconsider some fundamental assumptions. As the party wound down, with Mildred napping and my father chatting with the last remaining guests, Eric approached me by the kitchen sink where I was rinsing plates. "Can we talk?" he asked, picking up a dish towel. "There's something I've been wanting to tell you." I nodded, continuing to wash as he dried, the domestic rhythm strangely comforting. "I've been offered a teaching position," he said, "at the community college, military leadership and ethics." "Congratulations," I replied, genuinely pleased for him. "That sounds perfect for you." "It would mean leaving active service," he continued, "moving to reserves, something I never thought I'd consider." I handed him another plate, studying his expression. "What changed?" He was quiet for a moment, carefully drying the plate before placing it in the stack. "Everything," he finally said. "Meeting with the chaplain these past months, it's been challenging. He's helped me see patterns I didn't recognize, ways my upbringing shaped how I view authority, relationships, family." He set down the towel and turned to face me directly. "I've realized I was recreating my parents' marriage, my father's absence and authority, my mother's control. I thought that's what a family was supposed to be." The honesty in his voice was unmistakable, a vulnerability the old Eric would never have permitted himself to show. "The teaching position," he continued, "would give me more consistent hours, more time with Mildred, a chance to help shape young officers to understand that leadership isn't about control, it's about service." He hesitated. "And it would mean staying here, near you both, if that's okay." The request was tentative, respectful of boundaries in a way that would have been unimaginable a year ago. "I think that would be good for Mildred," I said carefully. "Stability, consistency, a father who's present." "And for us?" he asked, the question hanging between us with all its complicated implications. I took a deep breath, considering how to answer. "For us, it means a chance to continue building a healthy co-parenting relationship. Beyond that, I don't know, Eric. A lot has changed." He nodded, accepting this without argument. "I understand. I'm not asking for reconciliation. I haven't earned that, and maybe I never will. I'm just grateful you've allowed me to remain in Mildred's life, and by extension, in yours." Something in his humble acceptance brought tears to my eyes. Not from lingering hurt or renewed affection, but from recognition of how far we both had traveled. "Do you remember what that woman said on the subway?" I asked suddenly. "Judge Turner? Shame on you," he quoted immediately, his expression solemn. "I think about those words every day." "Me too," I admitted, "but for different reasons. For me, they were permission to feel what I had been suppressing, that what was happening wasn't right, wasn't normal, wasn't something I had to accept." He was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't see it then. I couldn't, but I'm trying to see it now, to really understand what I did, what my mother did, how it affected you." "I know you are," I acknowledged, "and that matters." We finished the dishes in companionable silence, a peace between us that wasn't about forgetting, but about acknowledging the harm done, the lessons learned, the growth still unfolding. Later that evening, after everyone had gone and Mildred was asleep in her crib, I sat on the porch swing with my laptop, adding a new chapter to my memoir. The words flowed easily, describing not just the pain of the past, but the careful reconstruction of the present. I wrote about Eric's evolution, without romanticizing it, about my own journey, without minimizing the difficulty. Most importantly, I wrote about what I had learned, that dignity isn't something others can give or take from you. It's an internal certainty that sometimes gets buried, but never truly disappears. As I typed the final paragraph of the chapter, I realized I was smiling, not because everything was perfect or because all wounds had healed, but because I had found my way back to myself. The woman I had become was neither defined by the control I had once accepted, nor by the rejection of it, but by the conscious choices I made every day to honor my worth and model strength for my daughter. In the quiet of that evening, with summer fireflies beginning to glow in the yard, I made peace not just with Eric's presence in our lives, but with the journey that had brought us here, the painful subway moment, the difficult birth, the months of rebuilding. Each step, however difficult, had led to this moment of quiet certainty. I remembered who I was. "Mommy, look! I found a treasure!" Mildred's excited voice carried across the park as she held up a smooth stone, its surface glinting with flecks of quartz in the afternoon sunlight. At 3 years old, she was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, finding wonder in objects others might overlook. "What a beautiful treasure," I affirmed, bending down to examine her find. "Should we add it to your collection?" She nodded solemnly, placing the stone in the small fabric pouch she carried for such discoveries. Her collection at home already filled a shelf. Rocks, feathers, unusually shaped leaves, all carefully arranged and regularly examined. It was a perfect September day in Central Park, the heat of summer finally giving way to autumn's gentle coolness. We had made the trip to New York for the launch of my second book, a collection of essays about motherhood, identity, and the unexpected paths that lead us to strength. "Mildred, over here." "Sweetheart." The familiar voice drew our attention to a bench near the playground where Judge Turner sat, elegantly dressed as always, her silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. At 79, she remained a formidable presence, though she had finally fully retired from her consulting work, focusing instead on mentoring young lawyers and advocating for family court reforms. Mildred ran to her, delighting in the embrace of the woman who had become like a grandmother to her. Their bond had developed through regular video calls and occasional visits, Judge Turner's wisdom and warmth providing another thread in the supportive tapestry we had woven around our small family. "Did you bring me a story?" Mildred asked eagerly. Judge Turner was known for her repertoire of children's tales, each one subtly embedding lessons about courage, kindness, and standing tall. "I always have stories for you," Judge Turner assured her, patting the bench beside her. "Shall we start with the one about the brave little turtle?" I left them to their storytelling and walked a few paces away, taking in the familiar skyline of the city I had once called home. New York held complicated memories now. The excitement of my early career, the whirlwind romance with Eric, the gradual erosion of my identity, the humiliation on the subway, and finally, the escape that had led to rebirth. Being back stirred those memories, but without the sting they once carried. Time and healing had transformed them from open wounds to important chapters in a larger story. My story, which now included not just those difficult moments but everything that had come after. The successful books, the speaking engagements where women approached me with tears of recognition in their eyes, the community we had built in Rochester, and most importantly, the joyful, secure childhood we were creating for Mildred. My phone buzzed with a text from Eric. "Flight landed. Should be at the hotel in about an hour. Still okay for me to take Millie to dinner?" I smiled at his continued carefulness, the way he still checked rather than assumed, respecting the boundaries we had established. "Absolutely," I texted back. "She's excited to see you. We're in Central Park with Judge Turner right now." Eric's relationship with Mildred had flourished over the past 2 years. His teaching position had provided the stability he promised, allowing for regular visits and shared holidays. More importantly, he had continued his work with the chaplain, gradually untangling the rigid beliefs about authority and family that had been instilled in him since childhood. We remained legally separated, but had found a workable peace. Not the passionate love we had once shared, but a thoughtful collaboration centered on Mildred's well-being. There were moments when I glimpsed the man I had initially fallen in love with, moments that sometimes made me wonder what might have been if we had met at different points in our journeys. But those thoughts were fleeting, acknowledged and then released without regret. My life had expanded in ways I couldn't have imagined during those dark months of pregnancy. The column had led to the memoir, which had led to speaking engagements, which had led to a community of women supporting each other through similar journeys. I had dated occasionally, though nothing serious had developed, partly because of my focus on Mildred and my career, partly because I was content in the fullness of my life as it was. "Olivia?" I turned at the sound of my name, surprised to see a familiar face. Approaching across the grass, Sarah, the paramedic who had helped deliver Mildred. "Sarah?" I exclaimed, genuinely delighted by the coincidence. "What are you doing here?" "I live here," she laughed, gesturing vaguely toward the west side of the park. "Transferred to a Manhattan station about a year ago. But what about you? Last I heard you were in Rochester. Just visiting for my book launch?" I explained. "Tomorrow evening at Strand Bookstore." Her eyes widened with recognition. "Wait, you wrote Silence Before the Roar? I read that. I had no idea that was you, though the story did seem familiar." She shook her head in amazement. "And that little girl under the tree with the older woman? Is that the baby from that night?" I nodded, pride warming my voice. "That's Mildred, named partly after the judge she's sitting with, actually." Sarah's gaze moved between Mildred and me, her expression softening. You know, in this job, we often meet people on their worst days. We help them through a crisis and then never know what happens after. It's really wonderful to see you both thriving. You made a difference that night, I told her sincerely. More than you know. We chatted for a few minutes more before Sarah had to continue her run, promising to try to attend the book launch the following evening. As she jogged away, I reflected on how many strangers had become pivotal characters in my story. Sarah and her partner delivering Mildred, the elderly gentleman who had offered me his seat on the subway, and most significantly, Judge Turner with her 3 transformative words. I rejoined Mildred and Judge Turner, who had apparently progressed from the turtle story to an interactive game involving different animal walks. I watched as my daughter waddled like a duck, then hopped like a rabbit, her joyful laughter carrying across the playground. She's remarkable, Judge Turner observed, her eyes twinkling. A perfect blend of confidence and compassion. I hope so, I replied. That's what I'm aiming for anyway. You've done well, Olivia, she said, her tone carrying the weight of her years of wisdom. Better than well. You've broken a cycle that could have continued for generations. The significance of her words settled over me. It was true. Had I stayed in that controlling environment, had I continued to accept diminishment as my due, what would Mildred have learned? What pattern would have been set for her future relationships? Instead, she was growing up with a mother who spoke her truth, who valued her own dignity, who had rebuilt a life centered on mutual respect. She had a father who, while imperfect, was actively working to unlearn harmful patterns and model healthier masculinity. She had a grandfather who demonstrated unconditional love, a circle of strong women who showed diverse ways of moving through the world, and Judge Turner herself, a living example of moral clarity and courage. Your book launch tomorrow, Judge Turner continued. How are you feeling about it? Nervous, I admitted. The memoir was one thing, my personal story. But this book makes broader arguments about the subtle ways women are conditioned to accept less than they deserve, about the systems that enable control, disguised as protection or tradition. It feels more political. Truth often is, she replied simply, which makes it both necessary and frightening to speak. We were interrupted by Mildred, who had spotted a dog being walked nearby and needed immediate reassurance that we could say hello to it. After securing the owner's permission, for a brief petting session, we continued our walk through the park, eventually making our way toward the exit where we would meet Eric. He was waiting at the agreed spot, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt, rather than the uniform that had once seemed like his second skin. The past 3 years had softened him somewhat, a few strands of gray at his temples, laugh lines more prominent around his eyes. He still stood with military posture, but the rigid formality had given way to something more relaxed. Daddy, Mildred called, breaking away from me to run toward him. He knelt to catch her, lifting her into a hug that spoke volumes about the relationship they had built. Affectionate, secure, joyful. There's my girl, he said, his voice warm. I've missed you so much. Over Mildred's shoulder, his eyes met mine, a silent acknowledgement of the journey that had brought us here, the harm done and the healing found, the painful past and the hopeful present. Judge Turner, he greeted her with genuine respect as we approached. It's good to see you again. Eric, she replied with a nod. You're looking well. Teaching agrees with you, I take it? It does, he confirmed, though it comes with its own challenges. I have a new appreciation for the patience you showed us during those first difficult conversations. Judge Turner smiled. Growth is never comfortable, but always worthwhile. We walked together to the street where Eric had arranged for a car to take him and Mildred to dinner, as I helped buckle her into the car seat, reviewing the schedule. For the evening and tomorrow's book launch, I was struck by how ordinary this moment would appear to any observer, a co-parenting exchange like countless others happening across the city. Yet 3 years earlier, such a peaceful transition would have been unimaginable. The control that had once characterized our interactions had given way to mutual respect. The rigid expectations had been replaced by flexible cooperation. The silent surrender had transformed into open communication. Before closing the car door, I leaned in to kiss Mildred's forehead. Be good for Daddy, okay? I'll see you back at the hotel for bedtime. I will, she promised solemnly. Then, with the sudden earnestness that sometimes emerged from her 3-year-old wisdom, she added, Mommy, are you happy? The question caught me by surprise, not because it was difficult to answer, but because it came from such a young child with such clarity. Yes, sweetheart, I replied honestly. I'm very happy. Good. She nodded, satisfied. Judge Turner says we should be happy because we are brave. I glanced at Judge Turner, who stood nearby with a small smile. She's right, I confirmed. Being brave helps us find our happiness. As the car pulled away, Judge Turner linked her arm through mine. Wise child, she observed. She sees more than we think. She does, I agreed. I hope she always keeps that clarity, the ability to recognize truth when she sees it. We began walking toward the subway station, the autumn breeze gently rustling the trees overhead. Judge Turner was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the measured certainty that had changed my life that day on the train. Do you know why those 3 words affected you so deeply? She asked. Because they validated what I was feeling, I suggested. They confirmed that what was happening wasn't normal or acceptable. Partly, she nodded. But more importantly, they weren't addressed to you. I looked at her, puzzled. I didn't say, poor you, or even be strong, she explained. I said shame on them. It placed the responsibility where it belonged, not on the woman being mistreated, but on those doing the mistreating. The insight resonated deeply. So many women, myself included, had been conditioned to internalize mistreatment, to question our own reactions rather than the actions that provoked them, to silence ourselves. For peace rather than speaking truth to power. That's what your books do, Olivia, Judge Turner continued. They say shame on them, not to encourage bitterness or vengeance, but to correctly allocate responsibility, to free women from the belief that they somehow deserve or invite diminishment. As we descended into the subway station, I found myself glancing at the seats, remembering that pivotal moment of public humiliation that had ultimately led to liberation. The memory no longer carried pain. Instead, it served as a milestone, marking the moment when external shame had begun its transformation into internal strength. The next evening, as I stood at the podium in the Strand bookstore, looking out at the gathered crowd, I felt that strength flowing through me. The audience included familiar faces, Judge Turner in the front row, my father beside her, Eric with Mildred on his lap, Sarah from the back of the room giving me an encouraging thumbs up, and many strangers, women whose eyes held stories similar to mine. 3 years ago, I began. I stood trembling on a subway car, 9 months pregnant, as my husband yanked me from a seat I had just been offered. Don't you dare sit while my mother is standing, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. In that moment of public humiliation, as I struggled to remain upright while his mother took my seat, something inside me began to break open, not in destruction, but in revelation. The room was silent, every face attentive. A woman I didn't know, a retired family court judge who would later become a dear friend and mentor, looked my husband in the eye and said 3 words that changed everything. Shame on you. Not, I'm sorry this is happening to you, not, you poor thing, but shame on you, placing the responsibility precisely where it belonged. I paused, looking directly at Judge Turner, whose eyes shimmered with unshed tears despite her dignified composure. Those 3 words began a journey that led to the birth of my daughter, to finding my voice again, to writing the memoir many of you have read, and now to this new book. They taught me that dignity isn't something others can grant or withhold. It's innate, undiminishable, eternal. We may forget this truth when surrounded by voices that try to make us small, but it remains, waiting for us to remember. As I continued, reading selections from the book, I was aware of Mildred watching me intently from her place on Eric's lap. Too young to understand the specifics, she nevertheless seemed to grasp the essential truth, that her mother was standing tall, speaking clearly, sharing wisdom drawn from both pain and healing. When the reading ended and the applause faded as people lined up for signed copies, Mildred wiggled down from Eric's lap and made her way to me, climbing onto my chair beside the signing table. You did good, Mommy, she whispered in my ear. You were brave like the turtle in Judge Turner's story. I hugged her close, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair, marveling at how this small person, once the vulnerable baby in my womb during that subway confrontation, had become my greatest teacher in courage and joy. Later that night, after Mildred was asleep in the hotel room's second bed, I stood by the window looking out at the New York skyline, reflecting on the symmetry of the journey. The city where I had lost myself had now become the place where I most fully claimed my voice. The public humiliation that had once threatened to break me had transformed into public affirmation of the strength I'd found. My phone buzzed with a text from Eric, who had returned to his own room after helping with Mildred's bedtime routine. You were impressive tonight. Millie was so proud. I hope you know I am too. The message carried no hint of the controlling husband he had once been, no suggestion of ownership or authority, just genuine appreciation from one co-parent to another, from a man who had done his own difficult work of growth. I texted back simply, "Thank you. That means a lot." Setting down my phone, I turned to look at Mildred, peaceful in sleep, her small hand curled around the stuffed turtle Judge Turner had given her earlier that day. In the soft light of the bedside lamp, I could see both Eric and myself in her features, his determined chin, my curious eyes, our shared stubbornness in the set of her brow even in sleep. She would grow up knowing a different story than the one I had temporarily accepted. Not a narrative of dominance and submission disguised as tradition, but one of equality, respect, and the courage to speak truth. She would know that dignity isn't negotiable, that love doesn't require diminishment, that silence can transform into a roar when necessary. And she would know these things not just because I told her, but because she had seen me live them. As I prepared for bed, I thought of all the women who had approached me after the reading, some with tears in their eyes, some with stories of their own journeys from silence to voice, all with a shared understanding of what it means to reclaim yourself after trying to be someone else's version of who you should be. I thought of Judge Turner, whose 3 simple words had broken through the fog of my acceptance, reminding me of truths I had temporarily forgotten. I thought of my father, who had provided safe harbor when I needed it most. I thought of Eric, who had ultimately chosen growth over control, however imperfectly and incompletely. Most of all, I thought of the woman I had become, neither defined by the pain of the past nor by the rejection of it, but by the conscious choice to live with authenticity and to speak with clarity. As I drifted toward sleep, I found myself returning to the closing lines of my memoir, the words that had resonated most deeply with readers and that had become something of a personal mantra. A woman's silence is never weakness. It's the pause before her roar. And when that roar finally comes, it doesn't destroy. It creates. It creates space for truth. It creates possibility for change. Most importantly, it creates a new story to replace the one that never should have been written. In the quiet hotel room, with my daughter sleeping peacefully beside me and the lights of New York twinkling through the window, I embraced the story we were writing now. A story of dignity reclaimed, of voice rediscovered, of love that honors rather than diminishes. A story worthy of telling, a story worthy of living.